There's a big difference between Zuma. Nobody has been liberated, neither the oppressed people nor the oppressor. Zuma was on Robben Island for 10 years. Nelson Mandela was there for 18 years. And we'd just like to correct an historical error which says that he was on Robben Island for 27 years. That's not true. We saw Nelson Mandela leaving the prison complex dressed in a suit. If they think they can strike a deal with Nelson Mandela and leave us out, they are making a big mistake.
In this, the year of liberation for all South Africans, we have thus characterized the year 1994 to express the deep-seated hope of all our people.
Nobody has been liberated, neither the oppressed people nor the oppressor. When you strike a compromise between the oppressor and the oppressed, something has gone wrong. And that was reflected in what was lauded as a good chance to have reconciliation, which was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Ironically, 22,000 people turned blacks appeared before the commission, and very few of the oppressors, the majority of the whites.
Yes.
What was also very disappointing was the fact that the people who orchestrated the apartheid terrorist regime, not just the apartheid regime, because they terrorized not only the 40 million indigenous people, but also the surrounding African states. And neither the Broederbond, which was established in 1918 as a secret organization, was subpoenaed by the TRC, neither the judiciary, your magistrates, judges and prosecutors who implemented the apartheid laws, nor the multinational companies who benefited the most from apartheid. And of course, the politicos like ex-President P.W. Botha, who were responsible for these.
What would you say, Imam, to people who still see people like Nelson Mandela as heroes and see him as a source of inspiration? Do you feel that he was an integral part of the compromise, or was he hoodwinked to a certain degree?
No, he wasn't hoodwinked. In his case in 1964, when he appeared in court, he made a statement which was later quoted in the Financial Mail and other business magazines, that he has never ever been opposed to capitalism, and that was the cue. So they already started trying to get him on board. So they softened him up, and that was the reason for removing him from other comrades on the island who were in the Rivonia trial. Accidentally, I bumped into the second in command of MK, and
that's Umkhonto Wesizwe.
Umkhonto Wesizwe. And he called me and he mistook me for somebody else, for an MK member, which I've never been. And he said to me, Ismail, which is not my name, if they think they can strike a deal with Nelson Mandela and leave us out, they are making a big mistake. So already there was a split, which was observable, that they knew that Nelson Mandela had been taken off the island in order to set in process the negotiations. No, there's a big difference between Zuma. Zuma was on Robben Island for 10 years. Nelson Mandela was there for 18 years. And we'd just like to correct an historical error which says that he was on Robben Island for 27 years. That's not true. The oldest serving political prisoner on Robben Island was in fact Jeff Masimula, who spent 27 years there, and he was in fact assassinated in what was called a motorcar accident shortly after he was released. So he definitely was the longest serving prisoner on Robben Island.
And he was a member of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, yes?
That is correct, a very staunch member who had received life imprisonment way back in 1963.
Right.
So Nelson Mandela obviously was the key to bringing about the changes. And a lot of the deals that took place, both in Lusaka and London, were directly related to him and involved him. When I was in Polesmoor prison, way back in the 80s, that would have been around about 86, I was arrested and held in detention. We saw Nelson Mandela leaving the prison complex dressed in a suit, and of course later on we discovered that these meetings were with Kobie Coetsee, one of the cabinet ministers. So obviously later on they confirmed that, and even meetings with the head of intelligence, Dr. Neil Barnett, and others. So it was a long process which started way back in 1982, and of course you had the Dakar conference and other feelers that were sent out. But it was very well orchestrated.
Yes.
The people who needed the settlement badly were in fact the multinational companies, the financiers, the banks, the investors, because the country obviously was going down a very slippery economic slope. They got them on board. Why did they choose the ANC? It's because the ANC has always been very comfortable with the concept multi-racism. And I found it ironical that Nelson Mandela, on two occasions, one is a set of essays written by Robben Island prisoners and edited by Mac Maharaj called Reflections from Robben Island. And the first essay is by Nelson Mandela. And in there he still refers to people as coloureds and as blacks and Africans. When he was at Wembley shortly after his release, he says the ANC is a non-racial organization, therefore all races are welcome.
Right.
Now that obviously is conceptual confusion. Many of our top thinkers in South Africa, when they say, when we called ourselves Africans, we meant that we were anti-racist. And very few people have used the concept anti-racism. We also draw a distinction between racism and racialism. Racism is based on statutes, on law, and it's enforced by the police, the courts, and eventually the army. Whereas racialism is when you and I discriminate against each other on whatever flimsy reason. And the fact that it is still very much part of South African life is the BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, and affirmative action, and also the outbreaks of xenophobia just consolidates that particular viewpoint, that racism and racialism is alive and well in South Africa.
Well, for a lot of people, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania is little known as a political entity.
Yes.
But everything you are articulating is very much in tune with what they say as well, because once upon a time you were a member, and it was led by Robert Mangaliso Sobuko, who is almost written out of the history of South Africa. Now, I'd like to ask you, what has happened to the PAC and that element of political thinking within South Africa now?
Yeah, you are quite right. Robert Sobuko was on Robben Island. He was held there for 6 years, and he was the only prisoner in the world who was held on Robben Island as a political prisoner due to a law passed in Parliament just for him. And it's known as the Sobuko Clause. And every year they had to renew his detention, and they had a very good reason, because they compared him to the late Albert Luthuli, Chief Albert Luthuli, and said, why couldn't you just ban Sobuko but release him from Robben Island? And the then Minister of Justice said, it's like comparing a heavyweight boxer with a flyweight boxer. Sobuko had a lot of clout, and his most important clout was intellectual. And that, sadly, that heritage has not been very well looked after, because what is now called, people called coloureds, he rejected and said those who are called coloureds are in fact indigenous Africans, because they're descendant from mothers or fathers who were indigenous.
And if I could interrupt you a little bit, he's the only African who I've heard defining an African not by the colour of their skin or even by their heritage, but by their love of the motherland Africa. And he saw that as the only way to resolve the contradictions to do with racial heritage within South Africa. Did you agree with that?
Yes, I fully agree with that. That is why I eventually joined the PAC. I was fortunate enough to serve for some period as chairman of the Western Cape, and subsequently as National Secretary General. Of course, I have now left because obviously a lot of infighting and splinter groups arose, and most important of all, the PAC couldn't get two things right. One was to have a sustainable financial backing, And the second one was a lack of a proper administrative structure. So based on that, they were not going to go anywhere. No. But they would have been opposed in any case by all the imperialist and neocolonialist powers in the world and on the African continent, because the national problem is essentially the regaining, the repossession of the land which was taken from the African people. So today, as we are talking here, there is a clause in the Constitution, in fact in the Bill of Rights, it's clause 25, which says that no land will exchange hand except through due process of law, which meant you've got to wait until they decide on this idea of willing buyer, willing seller, which they tried in Zimbabwe.